So once again, very nice evening to all different parts of the world from me in Czech Republic, but also good morning and good afternoon and a good day to you joining us from all different parts of the world again. My name is Lucie Vidovičová, and I'm a current president of the RC11 at the International Sociological Association. And we have here today with us Anne Martin Matthews for our third presidential lecture. I'm very happy that we can meet at this occasion because Anne had a great impact on my life and career, I may say, because I was the secretary while she was the president of RC11, and she gave me a few very important advices for my professional life. So I'm so happy to meet again at this occasion. This meeting will be recorded and then made available through the ISA website. So if you have some objections to that, please let us know. We can always use a chat to express your greetings or questions you may have during the talk. But I will now give Anne the floor to address us with her topic, Retrospective and Prospective Understandings of Aging, Living Our Subject Matter. And please do have ready your questions for the end of the talk. So thank you very much, and Anne, welcome once again. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Lucy. And it's morning here on the Pacific Coast of Canada, and I'm speaking to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, who were traditional holders of the land on the Pacific coast of the Northwest. So I'm delighted to be able to speak with you, and I know some people may join as we go along today. And in fact, this will be recorded for posterity, so others can see it in due course. I chose today to focus more on the, oh my gosh, are my slides not advancing? Lucy, we didn't try. Oh, there we go. Okay, there we are. Okay, I have to hit it a little harder. So I wanted to take this notion of retrospective and prospective, and I'll just refer to why that in a little later. But I'm going to divide our time together today really into two different parts, if you will. I've had a 45-and-a-half-year career. I just stepped down, or retired from the University of British Columbia in January of this year. And you look back over 45-and-a-half years, and what I decided to do was focus on some of the changes that I've observed in the field itself over time, and both in terms of the demography and the profile of older people and the sociology of aging itself, and then to focus for the bulk of our time on what it means to live our subject matter as sociologists who study aging. So focusing on self-reflexivity and also merging these different perspectives. Ironically, I was cleaning out my office in the Department of Sociology at UBC in the spring, and I came across a copy of the job talk from my very first ever job at the University of Guelph back in 1978, before many of you were born, I'm sure. But I think what's interesting about this is to actually what this comment about the research experience that Stella Jones wrote about, it is relevant for many of you as you begin or you're in the midst of your academic careers. And this certainly is very much how it worked for me. The notion of a journey across the country, serendipitous turns, finding the unexpected, plans must be altered in transit, unexpected delays. And in all of those things, detracting from or adding to the total research experience. So that was very meaningful for me to find that as I'm at the end of my paid professional career anyway, and to reflect on its implications. And so I thought it might be a nice way to start. And of course, I've also been very conscious in the last year or so that, as Kierkegaard has said, life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. So some of what I talk about seems like it has such a logic and a sequence and a plan to it, and that's not at all how it was experienced, in fact. So to give us some context as we begin today, I think it's really important to recognize that when I began my career in the late 70s, early 80s, I remember department heads saying, this is not just going to be a flash in the pan, is it? This stuff in aging, this focus in gerontology. And yet we have come to understand, and here's a World Population Aging document, how population aging is unprecedented and without parallel, that it is pervasive, and that different countries are in different stages, if you will, of the process, that it is enduring. Even though we talk about some changes with the baby boomers moving through the system, we're not going to return to the young populations that our ancestors knew unless something cataclysmic happens. But what we're studying has profound implications for many facets of human life. And I think it's just worth noting that that has really emerged as a totally accepted factor and feature of this stage of the world in a way that it wasn't there when I started my career. Also been extraordinary changes over the 45 years of this career in just the profile of people aging. Now, we all know, that's why we're here, that's why we study aging, that more people are living to old age. I would contend, and I've become more convinced as I've moved through my career, that this homogenization of the population over 60 or 65 is truly problematic. And I think it persists in our field to this day. The thing for me is the most interesting feature is not just that more people are living to old age. Pardon me, I've had a cold, but more people are living longer in old age. And as you can see here, I say we have multiple generations over 65. These are examples of people whom I know who are over 65, who have another generation in their family above them. And this is this notion of people changing, living potentially 20 to 40 years after this magic age of 60 or 65 changes our whole understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about sociology of aging or sociology of later life. So I've increasingly become aware and proselytizing, if you will, that when we talk about generations aging, whatever nomenclature, whatever language you use, young old, older old, deep old age, long-lived older people, whatever language or terminology you use, there are differences in characteristics and expectations, health behaviors and beliefs that we have to be aware of. I can see changes there are things that are different for me at 73 than my 81-year-old husband, than my 90-year-old friend. And that's the reality of process we have to be aware of. So that process fluidity, changing over time, more research on the older age groups. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I see that as a key issue that's changed over the course of my career. As well, in an area where I do research, changes in families and generations. And here I give a few descriptors of what families now look like: smaller, longer, more fluid, fewer births. Many older people will outlive their one child, later married, later divorced, geographical distance, mobility, all of these things. But they all come down to a key issue, a notable trend, and that is the co-longevity of generations. This is historically unprecedented. Gosh, I'm so sorry, I have a catch in my throat. Try to get rid of that. The co-longevity of generations, with huge implications for society, care, housing, etc. And this is an area where I think we do, as sociologists, need to spend more time focused on this issue. Another is an issue that's very characteristic in North America, and maybe during time for questions, we could discuss how true this may or may not be for other parts of the world. But, and I'm going to try to cite a number of prominent sociologists here today. But Eric Kleinenberg wrote the book Going Solo in 2012. And what's fascinating there is that in the early 1950s, when I was born, such a small proportion of the population, particularly in North America, was single. It was well less than half. Now we have about a third, in fact. Now we actually have it that I'm sorry, we're not single. I mean, the vast majority of people were married. Now we have about a third of the population in North America, at least, that is single, and in fact, over the age of 30. And in fact, it's estimated that over half of them live alone. So this has very interesting implications when you start to look at what this means for social connection, and particularly for us in sociology and gerontology, on the social contract between generations. What does that look like moving forward when you have large proportions of the population or significant proportions living on their own? So let me turn now to just looking a little bit at the field and about some issues of aging, some changes and gaps, methodologies, and new ways of knowing about aging and emergence of interpretive sociology. This is how I see our field as having changed over the course of my own career. When I started in 1978, a very prominent new publication was the Handbook of Aging in the Social Sciences. I'm going to cut to the chase and say that back in that time, if you looked at section C in the abstracts, in the index rather, the two C's were Canada and cohort. There was a concept missing in that list, and it's a concept that has appeared in every single handbook of aging and the social sciences since that time, with increasing complexity of discussion. I don't know if any of you can quickly figure out what concept is missing from that list, but it's caregiving, which is almost impossible to imagine that when I started my career, we didn't even use as social scientists in particular, we did not use the language of caregiving. So I don't actually fully know what this paradigm shift means. Some people will say it's a medicalization of the language of aging in later life. Certainly, it's a new language for framing intergenerational ties. And yet, I have certainly interviewed people who've said, actually, I do all this work, this stuff for my mother, but I don't think of it as caregiving. What does that signify in terms of what the terminology means to people? So a question that I'd like to pursue in this stage of my life when I'm free from teaching and those kinds of issues is, does this actually matter? What are the consequences for individuals, families, and society that this shift in the language of what we do for one another has changed? Maybe it just recognizes that there are more older people living longer with complex issues that require attention. But I would just point that out to you as an issue I think is worth exploring. A gap that I think has persisted through all the years of my own career, and I alluded to it a bit already, is a lack of penetrating focus on deep old age, the oldest old, or the very old. And it does strike me as I look internationally, and I've looked in not all countries of the world, so I'd be delighted to hear from any of you who are aware of other studies. The ones I'm keenly aware of are the Newcastle 85 plus, the Finnish Vitality 90 study, and there are others around the world, but these are some of the key ones that really are focused on later life. And what challenges us as sociologists of aging is to recognize that in studies like the Newcastle study, the diversity of capability at age 85. So those who live to 85 and beyond, it's almost as though we become ever heterogeneous as we come to these ages. So increasing longevity is, for some people, is not necessarily associated with very high levels of disability or dependency. It's as though these are survivors, and so they manifest as a group increasing heterogeneity of the older population. And I do think there's a particular role here for sociology of aging in advancing understanding of these phases of later life. And yet I would contend, and I just did a quick review of a couple of international journals this weekend, how many journals still focus very much on older people in their 70s, even early 80s, and less on, I'm seeing the editor of the Journal of Aging and Society nodding her head. And I think we as sociologists and social gerontologists need to move beyond it. This is a very interesting population. Also, over the course of my own career, I think there's been a fascinating emergence in what I would call ways of knowing about aging. So when I began, and for much of my career, we did survey research, we did interviews with older people. That was our modus operandi, if you will. But in recent years, I've become, and certainly used in my own teaching with students and seeing tremendous richness of discussion, ethnography. If you don't know Mika Lowe's 2013 Aging Our Way, what a wonderful book that is. It's a wonderful example of a fascinating ethnography conducted over a 4-year period in the Eastern United States. But I, with my own students, have looked at issues of other ways of knowing through film, through documentaries, through other kinds of cultural representations, trying to get closer and closer and closer to the older people themselves, not filtered through an interview, not filtered even through a film with a director, and just try, what are we seeing here? Social media is an interesting example, and there are some, I've had my students look at, for example, blogs, Reddit AMA. My own daughter pointed out to me, Mom, you can actually go in and find someone to ask me anything. And what's it like to be 100 years old? There's actually a whole genre of responses in there. So this field of netnography, it's a little bit of a Wild West in some ways, but it can bring a richness. We know that Julia Twigg and Wendy Martin have written in the Routledge Handbook of Cultural Gerontology about the rise of the visual, replacing the dominance of the word. And I will say that Julia and Wendy have really prompted numbers, me among them, someone who's written more traditionally about widowhood over many years, to take a broader cultural lens and engage more with other disciplinary orientations. So very rich. Through all of this time, I think it's been a powerful and effective advancement in our field, and that is moving from what one older person I interviewed described, moving from advocacy to partnership, from advocating on behalf of or for older people to partnership with older people. So you'll see this picture of a title page or a cover of a book here on your screen, Gray Matters. That's a book that was funded, actually, the research for it was funded by the Institute of Aging in Canada when I was scientific director, and actually talks about doing research with older people. So here again, sociology has a role to play, certainly in terms of as well in longitudinal collaborative research, and I'll come back to that a little bit more in the end. For me personally, a huge influential factor in sociology of aging over my career has been the emergence, and I think indeed greater acceptance of what we call interpretive perspectives on aging. And toward the end of the life of my doctoral supervisor, Victor Marshall, who died in 2018, I had the tremendous opportunity to actually publish a paper about the interpretive perspective on aging in this, the Bankston and Sederson Handbook of Theories of Aging. And if any of you are graduate students or early in your career, you'll know what a thrill it is to actually publish with your doctoral supervisor. So certainly the basic tenets of an interpretive perspective, and they're very dear to my own research and how I've conducted my research, is recognizing meanings and definitions as being constituted, really a focus on what matters to cohorts of people individually and collectively as they age. An element that I will speak about a little bit more in a moment is the understanding of behavior, including the meanings that actors give to what they and others do. And that has recently occasioned me to go back and think about some work that I had published earlier. What's the meaning? What's the social action that's embedded in this social phenomenon that I'm studying? What happens to social institutions and structures with population aging? So one of the basic points here is to emphasize that while many people think of interpretive perspectives as being very focused on the dyad, and very dyadic. You can actually utilize interpretive perspectives, adopt interpretive perspectives to advance understanding at the micro, meso, and macro levels. And in the chapter that we wrote in the Bankston and Sederson book, we actually give examples from studying, garment workers in Montreal and a whole array of broad social phenomena. But this has been a very influential change and activity during my own career, an important development. So let me switch now to the second half and sort of what's a bit more my focus. And that is this notion of self-reflexivity in aging and gerontology, actually bringing ourselves as researchers into what we're doing and in a very reflective way, our impact on our research's impact on us, what we're seeing, and then managing this notion of the prospective and the retrospective thinking together. Some years ago, we began to see in writings in social gerontology a reference in Gubrium and Holstein, and Jay Gubrium, a fine sociologist of aging, discussing a greater free play stemming from a radically reflexive openness that they saw emerging within sociology of aging and social gerontology. And the focus there is really on how academic knowledge about aging influences how we understand both our own aging and the aging of others around us. How personal experiences may help us identify gaps in theory and in practice. And we see some interesting examples of that. And when I first began to become familiar with this literature, I was conscious of how much of that I have done throughout my own career. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples in a moment that just try to capture that essence, that interrogation, if you will, of our own scholarship. Gunhild Hagestad and Rich Sederston in 2017 wrote an article about a personal reflection on aging, and it did a beautiful interweave of the personal and the professional. A fine article, if any of you are interested in reading it, and I'd be happy to send a reference along on that. A couple of years ago, I was in Newfoundland, which is the part of Canada in which I was born on the East Coast. I was receiving an honorary degree, and people actually, they write citations of you for these things. It's quite an interesting experience to sort of see how others look at your own career. And the person who read my citation at Memorial University was Professor Holly Pike, who is an English professor. And so she described me as someone who, throughout my writing, and she'd actually read some of the papers, bless her heart, and she described me as someone who she thought, interestingly, thought retrospectively and prospectively, merging prospective and retrospective thinking, looking forward and backwards, re-examining one's own data and early writing through the lens of new theoretical perspectives. And I was, peripherally conscious that I was interested in doing that, but to actually have someone define that as a feature of one's own career was an interesting motion, which I think set me on the journey of that took me to this, some of the issues I'm talking about with you today. I will say that a paper that I published in Current Sociology, Situating Home at the Nexus of the Public and the Private Spheres, really emerged from my own experience as a daughter in a family where my home care entered my family biography in 1998. I had been studying home and community care, both in Ontario, when I lived there in the early 90s, the 80s and early 90s, and then when I moved to British Columbia. But I found over the course of the data collection that we were doing, I often had to stand back because we are of course, to be objective. But I was constantly revisiting, even as we went through as members of my team and doctoral students and graduate students developed papers from the research project. I found myself sometimes with hindsight, like my mother lived for 14 years, paralyzed by a stroke. So home care was part of our family biography for 14 years. of my mother's life and the life of our family. That is a long time. And it occasioned many opportunities to go back and revisit my own data, to look for patterns that I hadn't seen before in the data, or through different lenses, particularly in terms of the gendered nature of space with female home care workers coming in, how that space became gendered, and then the role of these workers in the dynamics of the family and in care roles. So that was a very rich and worthwhile experience for me to do that. And as I say, something that was characteristic throughout my career. But of course, many argue that these issues become more prominent as we become older. So I think one of the very first examples that I could find and was certainly aware of in my own career of a sociologist who actually took a retrospective focus in their work and reflected on continuity and discontinuity was Gunhild Hagestad, 1996 paper. And that was her notion of being on time or off time or out of time. Happily, she was not out of time. Gunhild has had many years since then, but at the time, this was a concern. And what does that belief in one's potential mortality sooner rather than later, what does that bring to the meaning and the understanding and the importance of this older life that we're experiencing? That led some years later to, in the Journal of Aging Studies, a special issue on self-reflexivity amongst gerontologists. I'm going to quote one of those papers in particular in a moment. Joe Hendricks, the sociologist, I won't read every word of what he said here, but Joe talks here about sociologists needing to take heed, recognizing that human beings do not live two variables at a time, as we may be inclined to conduct our analysis, but come as complete, complex, and often messy packages. So try explaining that away in a way that captures its richness. So he was really challenging us to think in a more comprehensive way. And of course, some years after that, later in about a decade later, the Gerontologist published a special issue, Aging, It's Personal. And then a few years ago, the British Society of Gerontology is slightly different. It wasn't quite as self-reflexive, but the British Society of Gerontology published a 50th anniversary, a book to celebrate its own 50th anniversary, and celebrating the contributions of 50 different gerontologists across the UK and what they had done and the impact of their career. So linking that personal and professional in a way that actually told the story of the rise of gerontology in the United Kingdom. So to penetrate a little further, because this is an article that I love and I quote very often, Joe Hendricks' Coming of Age, and that special issue of the Journal of Aging Study. So as I entered this new phase of my life, as I like to put it, I'm not on anyone's payroll any longer. How does this speak to me? So he talks about the fact that those of us who study aging have a unique opportunity to live our subject matter. Whether we learn any lessons from that is open to question, but he contends that personal experience can make us far better scholars than scholarship alone. So two questions that I've thought a lot about since rereading this article a couple of years ago. How do our scholarly efforts and our experience come together in ways to enrich one or the other? And I alluded already to, in terms of some of my own 15 years of research on home and community care, I think some of, particularly the later papers from those studies, have been enriched by bringing a lens of experience to that. He also asks, how do we integrate what we know with how we live? And he argues that this goes to the very heart of our scholarly endeavors. How do we separate personal from professional life? So I think this is a very interesting challenge for those of us, particularly those who do qualitative or interpretive sociology, to engage with these questions. And I will confess here that I'm right at the beginning of doing this, of thinking much more self-reflexively about these issues and what they mean. But I would like to challenge us as members of RC11 to think more about these issues. And as we move through, as inevitably we will, move through our own aging careers. So let me take you through 3 examples where I feel this, the notions that John Hendricks has talked about, the living our subject matter, have impacted my own fairly recent scholarship in 3 particular ways. First of all, as I just briefly noted, I have now, it's actually more than 20 years, it's just coming up on 20 years, been engaged in a research program we refer to as the Nexus Home Care Research Program. And that was very much influenced by my experiences in a family that negotiated home care for our mother, and that home care entered the entire family. It wasn't one person impacted by this, the entire family for over a decade. In fact, it became 14 years. I was very struck early on in the process, even looking back at the research that I'd done in the 1980s before this happened in my own family, very struck by the conceptual binaries that exist in our understanding of the field. The notion we have a formal care system and an informal care system, or paid and unpaid. And I came to understand that, not completely, of course, but there are ways in which these are false dichotomies. One way that became very apparent to me early on in my conducting research with men and women who were employed as, whatever you call them, home care workers, home support workers, whatever the terminology in your own national context. Many of them would say, well, I actually care for Mrs. So-and-so in the morning, and I'm actually paid by this particular agency it might be a provincial health authority that's allocated a certain number of hours. That's insufficient. So the family pays me privately in the afternoon to come back, as long as I don't tell their mother that I'm there under a different funding formula in the afternoon. But I don't get enough work from the home care agency, so I have to supplement my income by working nights and weekends in a long-term care home or a retirement facility or something like this. So this, at the level of the worker, this wasn't a dichotomy at all. These individuals were moving back and forth between paid, unpaid, home-based, and institutional-based care systems all the time. And we've come to understand now the huge integration across those systems that occurs. I was also very interested why we call the project the Nexus, this intersection of public and private spheres, professional and non-professional, and paid and unpaid, and how that works. And when I went back a couple of years ago in a more proactive way to examine some of what we'd written in the early years of our project, I felt that what I was seeing there was not so much that personal experiences and scholarly research were in conflict, as that we were seeing different things. Now, it's okay to be seeing different things from what I've experienced, because I'm only one example of a person whose family has been implicated by home care. Some families have no resources, like our family did, to purchase extra services. Some have very few family members or no one available at all to actually help supplement the care that's provided at home in the way that's essential to how the system operates and is understood. So I want to say that unequivocally, but there were times when I felt the need to dive deeper, not to get the answer that reflected my reality, but to understand there was more to the story than we were able to penetrate in the analysis that we were doing. So I'll draw your attention here to one particular element. So there was a model that Joni Sims Gould and I developed in 2010 in the early days of this study. 12 years later, Maria Torrejon, in an article in the Journal of Care and Caring, International Journal of Care and Caring, revised our conceptual model. And I just noticed some colleagues in Nova Scotia and Manitoba, Canada, have recently been writing about, they haven't used this model, but they've been writing about this issue. So let me point, if I use my arrow here, you can't see that, can you? You can't see that I'm moving an arrow. Okay. So if you look at the top of the circles here between home support worker and older person receiving care, you'll see that a solid red line implies direct care. A purple line of slashes is assistive care, and then the little tiny dots are caregiving. What we decided to put in here, and quite intentionally, was that series of dots, the dotted line, from older person receiving care to home support worker. Now, usually you think is the worker coming in and providing direct care to the older person. What we found in countless situations, and we often think that people, and we know that people receiving home care today are sicker than people used to be. They had much higher levels of acuity than there were when we even began this research 15, 20 years ago. But it would be a rare person whose circumstances made no difference to that experience of direct care. It might even just be that the person is largely passive, but they're having a bad day, good days, bad days, good hour, bad hour. That would have an impact back on the whole experience, back in terms of what the home care worker is experiencing. We also found the prevalence of this notion of what we called assistive care, and that might be the older person saying, well, they come to give me a bath, so I draw the water before they get there. I lay out the towels and the soap, or I can't get off the bed very well. I can't get into the bathroom, but I try to lay out some of my clothes, or I try to do this at the table. The primary carer, the family member, would often do some of that, but many older people didn't have that situation. They did something. They did something that, and it was often with a sense that they needed to be convert this into a reciprocal kind of relationship in some way. So we thought very carefully, and we have some examples and things we've written about that little line, dotted line back from the older person to the home support worker. And what's been interesting since we did that, I've been more conscious of literature, such as the recent work by Couric, writing with my Canadian colleagues, Janet Keefe and Laura Funk, about the contributions that older people themselves make to their own care situation. And instead of always inevitably, irrevocably seeing older people as passive recipients of care, this is an effort. It may be imperfect. It may be overgeneralized. We could discuss that, but it's capturing a contribution that older people themselves make to the dynamic of their care relationship. So that would be an example of a case where we went back, did essentially a meta-analysis of our own data, and captured elements, thinking as well about the findings of others, like the other colleagues I've noted here, in recognizing this dynamic. Another example where this more self-reflexive or aging as subject matter has come in my understandings of ways of knowing about widowhood. Now, I wrote a book, Widowhood and Later Life, back in the 1990s. This isn't actually the proper cover because I would never sign my surname Matthews, but this is what you find on screen when you're looking for a copy of your own cover. I became very interested in how social media might contribute to understanding widowhood and life course perspective, as contrasted to the traditional way that I or people like Helena Zaniaka Lopata and others looked at the notion of widowhood. And so I've actually spent some time in the last year or two looking at websites and blogs about and by older people and how they advance ways of knowing about widowhood and aging. I discovered over 1 million websites about widowhood. Extraordinary diversity of experiences that are very targeted on particular groups of older widowed people. But what we're seeing in some cases there is a shift, an effort to counteract the narrative of deficit and decline, which has predominated the research on widowhood. And I will say, reflecting Hendrix's focus on self-reflexivity, several of my own friends have recently been widowed, and we spend time there's 4 of us who are sociologists of aging. We Zoom every 3 weeks together. Some of you may know Sarah Matthews, who used to be at Cleveland State and in Ohio, Ingrid Kanitas, University of Western Ontario, and Carolyn Rosenthal, University of Toronto, all retired sociologists of aging. We have a lot of fun, but we do talk about this type of thing in our spare time as well. And what it means, what one might have understood from the literature and the depictions of widowhood, and how that both supports one's own experience of widowhood, but what are the points of divergence and what the literature may have missed. Finally, and this is the work that I'm doing right now, when I talked about this 15-year program of research, or nearly 20-year program of research on home and community care. A couple of years ago, I went back and did a lot, after we'd sort of been publishing some more of the papers, but I was asked to write a chapter about home care space by a group of geographers. And I really focused in on all the places we talk about the actual context of where care takes place. So in the course of that, emerged a focus on concepts like collectivity, contingency of the space, the diversity of who's occupying the space. Is it collaborative space where people are working together? Is it contested space? And I've never been a geographer or a spatial researcher, but it was fascinating to bring that lens to a concept with which I was very familiar. Burpee Timonen and I have talked a lot about this notion of time in home care. And Verpee is one of a number of colleagues who has written about the tyranny of time, the compression of time in home care. And this is treated as a facet, a dominant feature of the home care experience, and something that's become more compressed, more contested, more tyrannical, if you will, even over the 15, 20 years of our research. Recently, I was reading some transcripts from that research and thinking, people are social actors. As a sociologist, I believe people are social actors. Coming back to some of the points I made for you at the very beginning. What do older clients, workers, family friend carers do about the compression of time, the tyranny of time? We talk about it as something that exists, but we're social actors. What do we do about it? How do we act? And under what constraints? Because we know there are tremendous constraints. So some colleagues and I have recently developed a typology of 4 types of what we call time tactics in dealing with this notion of the compression of time or the tyranny of time in households. So this, I think, is an interesting example where, as social scientists, where our research is grounded in our understanding of human beings as social actors who are, when confronted with a situation like the reduction of time and the reduction in what can be done whilst a worker is in the home, how, when possible, is that managed and negotiated? So this has been really fun and exciting for me to think about themes that were in our data that we didn't even focus on previously. We didn't ask about this explicitly, and yet this emerged in the context of the interviews, hundreds of interviews in British Columbia, Ontario, and Nova Scotia with workers and clients, etc. We saw what we were looking for, we analyzed what we asked about, and yet there were these significant themes in the data which have emerged now with this new lens that we bring to the analysis. So I encourage us as social scientists to think about doing more of that. A couple of other quick examples I'll give you before I finish, because I'd like to leave a couple of minutes for some questions and discussion if we can. I think there are tremendous opportunities for the sociology of aging as we move forward. I alluded a few moments ago to longitudinal research. There's much more longitudinal research, of course, funded and being conducted than was remotely possible when I started my career in 1978. So I alluded to this need to recognize that we can all spend 20 to 40 plus years in this stage of life called old age and later life. And the need to focus on how the me at age 73 and the issues that I confront may be very different from the me and the issues I'm confronting at age 96. Or 93 or whatever, hopefully as long as I'll live. So capturing the notion of process and time. And I've been quite heartened here in the Canadian context recently. My 2 sociologists, Janice Keefe and Laura Funk, have conducted research on what they call home care pathways, and really focusing on trajectories and transitions. And it's been fascinating to get comments from reviewers and see the comments coming back from reviewers who'll say, why would you actually have interviewed someone who's 76 and is not getting home care? Well, That's because they actually didn't used to get home care. They previously got home. The pathway is that they got to a point particularly as happens when home care following acute injury, where you move out of home care. You might move back into it again, or you move on to something else. So the notion of pathways is accepting that diversity of experience that can come in later life. And I applaud this as an example, I think, of where we in sociology need to go. I also just want to make a reference, and I did also have an additional note here about the opportunities for collaborative research. And I wanted to just the research lens is obviously what we're about. We're the Research Committee on Aging of the ISA, but it's important to understand the broad context of when we do collaborative research, what might be the opportunities for, and also the costs or the challenges in doing that kind of work. So I've chaired a number of tenure and promotion review committees in the Department of Sociology, and over the recent years, we see more and more colleagues who are publishing with collaborators from other fields. One of my colleagues in particular has many colleagues in health disciplines, and you can imagine how many collaborators they have, but sometimes there are other disciplines as well. And it's always a task for someone reviewing the tenure file to go through the published work and to attempt to discern where the sociological contribution of this piece is. Not just that the name was added to the paper, but in this corpus of work, how has the sociology informed the work that's being done, the overall impact of what we're saying. Sometimes it's more or less there, depending on the relative contributions, scope and contributions of the particular contributor, but it needs to be there in some way. And I think that's important for us to understand that when we're working collaboratively, ensuring that that sociological lens is actually apparent. I think sociology can also bring other fascinating dimensions. One of my doctoral students, Maria Jose Torrejon, and I were working on a manuscript from her dissertation, and she focused on social capital. And as I said to her, Maria, social capital is really not my area of strength. You had other people on your committee when you looked at this, but we're trying to get, work toward publications from each of the papers in your dissertation. And I found a reference, an editorial in Sociology of Sociology of Health and Illness, Sociology of Health and Illness, a journal we thought would be good to publish in, that talked about trying to understand social capital from outside some of the dominant paradigms which we use to explain it. And lo and behold, Ingrid Kanitas had just written, again, it's a fantastic paper on the notion of who counts as family in later life. And she's got 3 different ways that family can be counted by individuals to matter as individuals grow older. And we talked about, and I said, Maria, I think that's your hook for this paper on social capital. Let's see if a health journal will accept this sociological framing of a question of support in later life. And they did. So again, I think an example of where sociology can inform where we're going in terms of areas of inquiry, such as social capital, which is often seen as having roots outside our discipline. 2 final slides. I think it's important, while we talk about the potential and the promise of sociology as we move forward, to also understand, gosh, it's been frustrating to be part of this field for 45 years. When we see articles like this come up. Now, Andre Picard is a Canadian health columnist with our national newspaper, the Globe and Mail. And back in the spring, there was an article lamenting, as was rightly so, the fact that British Columbia was sending patients to the United States for cancer care because we can't provide these services in our own province. I suspect, frankly, parenthetically, we won't be doing this for much longer. But anyway, what I've highlighted in green was his line, because he talks about, we've known about the baby boomers for 6 decades. We knew that cancer incidence was going to increase because the population was growing older. But this is a point I think that is important to focus on. He contends at some point, we have to stop pretending that the aging of the population and the shift in care that needs to accompany it is a surprise. We have to be aggressively proactive, not pitifully reactive. Now, of course, some of this is moving into the policy domain. Absolutely. It's moving out of research per se, but I think it is relevant. I think here again, we have a job to do I talked very early on about the enduring, the unprecedented nature of population aging, and yet recognizing that we conduct our research and do our scholarship in a world which is largely pitifully reactive when it comes to issues of aging and population aging. This is our lingering challenge, I firmly believe. So to conclude, I hope I've highlighted a number of things that resonate with some of you, but I think it is important for us to use our sociological imagination. And in terms of my own career, I've cast so much of my understanding of the social phenomena that I'm looking at in terms of C. Wright Mills and the understanding of private troubles and public issues at both institutional and individual levels to help us better understand narratives of aging, realities of later life, and the points of intersection that we have. That is key. I am convinced that sociology has a tremendous amount to offer. And I say this as someone who comes from a department where aging is not a focus. When I retired, that was the end of aging in my department. I was never able to expand a focus on aging in my home department, whereas it's been very easy across the university. An interesting example, I think, is my last class, 15 PhD students. The department just kind of let me do what I wanted and let me admit as many students as I dared to take. But I had 15 PhD students from 5 different departments of the university: psychology, nursing, social work, population and public health, and I had 2 from sociology. Sad commentary. So we've got a lot of work to do. I've also alluded to this notion of homogenization. I'm delighted we no longer use the language of the elderly. When we talk about later life, it's a meaningless terminology. And this recognition that this age that we're talking about can span 30 or 40 years or more. I think we're a long time getting that message across. And then finally, sociology's potential to help advance understanding of the pathways and trajectories of later life, I think is a key issue that we need to be aware of moving forward. So thank you for your attention. And I'll stop sharing my screen so I can see you. And I think, yes, I left at least a couple of minutes, Lucy, hopefully.
Thank you so much. This was very inspiring. I already have some comments of my own, but of course, if there are any questions or even comments, how do you reflect that in your own life, please take the floor. We are ready to receive your comments and questions.
I will go first, and I want to first of all congratulate ma'am and the team who's organized this. I was somebody will tell you then, I joined this meeting an hour ago from India, and my apologies for that. I was waiting for this, and I'm so happy that I joined in and attended the whole of it. It was so fascinating and enlightening. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for, just listening was complete fun and complete enlightenment. Thank you so much. In India out here, we are still in a stage where we are learning gerontology. And just like I said that I am a sociology person, I've been teaching sociology for 30 years, 30 plus years in Sophia College at UG level. And 3 years ago, we managed to introduce gerontology in our academia. We did not have it at UG level at all. But having said that, these lectures are really very helpful. I want to ask you just one question. I mean, just a query. Do women make better gerontologists than men? I just need to know this because we are caregivers, and as we age, We understand caregiving in a different way. So what is your take on it?
I don't know that I'd come down on the side of one versus the other, actually. I will just note we had a recent meeting in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and it was there were two different meetings came together. One was called Age Well, which was an aging and technology group, and I'm linked with that group of colleagues. And then we switched to the Canadian Association on Gerontology meeting, and I was fascinated that in the transition from one to the other, we went from a conference that was male dominated, particularly young male dominated, because of course it had aging and technology, to rooms which were very largely, well, they were female dominated rooms. So I think, in fact, most of us in the field have spent most of our lives where we're working in aging, working with female colleagues. And yet I think we can all think of people in our own sociology of aging, male colleagues who've contributed enormously. Victor Marshall was my doctoral supervisor, and Victor was, a gold standard mentor. So I think some of us feel we were actually very well mentored, but a lot depends on, the context and the situation. But I still think we're very much a female-dominated profession. Is that true, Lucy, in terms of the membership of RC11? Is it primarily female? I mean, I think of people like Andreas Hoff and others who've been there for a long time.
Yes, there are. I don't have the statistics. We may have to have a look at that. But just recently, Czech Sociological Association had run a survey. They were looking at different topics that men and women in the sociology attend. So there may be equal in numbers, but their topics differ. And that may be also the case. That may be the case even within social gerontology.
That would be interesting to know what those topics are. We could talk about that at the next meeting. Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for that. Nice to know. I mean, the Pacific Northwest to India, that's a good coverage of the globe.
Do we have some other comments or questions coming in?
So I had a question, Anne. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was good to hear how you would put into perspective the kind of writing that Gunil had done and others, because I've been reading those special issues.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was really interested in sort of figuring out which take would you take, because I've read the work that people have written through the years, both the Gerontology special issue and the Journal of Aging Studies. I actually think that perhaps, and this is a suggestion for Lucy, that we could approach Tony and Thomas and Chris Phillipson about having a book in the global aging series, that it's about sociologists of aging coming of age. Yeah. Because I think it would be really interesting to assemble that sort of writing in a book that could be potentially useful nonetheless for teaching. Sort of to say, okay, from the perspective of navigating the personal and the professional, or my own field of research, these are the things I've learned along the way. About, it could be topics or measurements or whatever. Anyway, that was just an idea, just throwing it to Lucy. But something I wanted to ask was about your last slide. So I'm always having a hard time trying to figure it out how to explain pathways and trajectories to people. Yeah. So could you indulge, like where does the difference lay?
You mean between pathways and trajectories?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Because I think sometimes people use them interchangeably. Yeah. And sometimes people define them differently. And I haven't been able to understand the difference. So since you use pathways and trajectories, I wonder, how do you think about it?
It's interesting. You should, and I can't say that I have actually deeply interrogated for myself what I understand those differences to be. I think of trajectories, and I added it. I was thinking more in terms of pathways, sociology, because pathways, assuming kind of almost like the going back. You could also go back as well as go forward. You move around, you come back to something as a status you were in before. I added trajectories because, of course, I was very involved in the launch of the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, and we talked a lot about capturing trajectories. So I think of trajectories as almost more, dare I say, individualistic, but it was more like health, moving through different kinds of healthcare systems. But I would say, and a rap on the knuckles to me. I was probably casually using them more interchangeably, Sandra. So where there's a literature that treats them quite differently, I was thinking of, one was telling us a little bit different, something different than the other.
Yeah.
But I didn't have that refined in my mind at all.
Yeah.
Interesting
Okay,
point.
because I get this question once in a while, and then I have to go back to reading, and then I sometimes find things that differentiate them, but I don't think the differentiation is easy enough to explain.
Yeah, or crisp or whatever. Or
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I saw a definition a couple of years ago that said that pathways can go back and forth.
Yes, which is
while trajectories have an endpoint that is easily discernible.
Okay.
But I don't think that's a good enough for crisp. So that's why I was asking whether you had.
That probably captures the essence of the distinction when I decided to add them both. But
Okay.
I'll be more refined in my use of language moving forward.
I don't know. Yeah. And the other question I wanted to ask is have you thought of any kind of wording or conceptual framework that you've used through the years that has switched its meaning? And the reason why I'm asking this is because I'm now delving into the literature on documentation practices in social work, and I've noticed a really interesting terminology shift. So, for example, we tended to call the practice of deciding who would get help need assessment, whereas nowadays we're calling it care management.
Interesting.
So all of a sudden we're shifted. Is it about assessing of needs in an older person? It's become, what is it about the care that we can provide? So that wording, it's sort of shifting who is this being done for? And one, it's more welfare sector gatekeeping resources, whereas the other one is more about the older person and their needs. So I wonder if there is anything in your line of research through the years where you've noted a shift in wording.
I mean, that's a fascinating example, Sandra. I mean, good for you for identifying. The only thing that comes really quickly to mind, and I'm sure the minute we're off screen, I'll think of three things, but the thing that comes quickly to mind is, when I alluded at the very beginning to the emergence of this concept of caregiving, and I had been trained and did my PhD in a world of understanding, Shannis and Sussman, family ties in later life. So and we used to talk then about, we wouldn't use the terminology today, but normative family life. So the exchange of care, and I feel that and support. I feel that we went through a period in early stages of my career where the notion of the older person as actor and having agency and being a member of a family with a history and I was about to say trajectory, having a history and understood in that dynamic, all of a sudden this person, when they needed help, became defined as a care receiver, a very passive recipient action or label. And that dominated the field, I would say, for a long time.
Yeah.
So there was kind of this very negative thing that happened, because I think what you're talking about is actually maybe trying to recognize more, as we do today, the agency of the older person. That we approach an older person, not just a family member, not just in terms of who we see before us today on a given day, be it a good day, bad day, but with all the history and everything that goes into that relationship. And that gets lost in the language of care receiver. So I think the good news is, and maybe if you live long enough, you'll see a concept or a way of understanding or approaching be a certain way, become more negative or problematic in some way, and then start to see a shift. So that, it was an imperfect example in our own model, but I cite the work of some colleagues from the Nova Scotia, Manitoba as well, in saying the recognition that no matter how severe, for example, the dementia or the illness that is putting a person in a situation, there is a person alive inside there, and their personhood is relevant to the understanding of that interaction. So I think there's a bit more of it's not a single concept in the way I think, Sandra, that you're talking, but it's an understanding of that, that individual's place in the dynamic, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Which reminds me, thinking of Anaga, who's with us in India, it reminds me of that anthropology work this book that was written 15 years ago, No Aging in India. It's called.
Interesting.
Yeah, where it says that
Absolutely.
it says that aging wasn't deemed to be a part of the life course differentiated from the rest in India for many, many years. And it's when we introduced the language of Alzheimer's, cognitive deficiency, that all of a sudden aging became, Anaga, you need to tell me whether it makes sense. But that's the way he described it. It's
Yeah.
like this did something to the way in which we
Yes.
thought about the later part of our life course.
Yes.
Once we started to think of not aging as a process, but the effects of older age and different kinds of cognitive or physical abilities, that shifted the conversation. So I found that book really, really interesting.
Well, that's good. I have more time for reading now, so this is
Yeah.
wonderful. I actually have just
You must read that. But Sandra, your observation is absolutely right. Even now, we don't talk about retirement. We don't talk about, forget post-retirement. We don't talk about retirement as if, it's something that we should not talk about. It's a negative thing. So, just the other day, we were talking about in our college, we were talking about what is voluntary retirement for women. Okay, there are so many women lecturers who come and say that I happen to be also the institutional head. So I'm looking into administration. And every time a woman comes in or a lecturer comes in and says, I have decided I'm going for voluntary retirement, it is not to look after herself, but to look after her mother-in-law or to look after her mother. And it is happening so often right now. It's a cause of concern because have you planned your retirement? No. I've only decided that I have to look after somebody else. Have you realized that you will need care as you take your voluntary retirement? Well, that clause is not come in yet. So, Sandra, you're absolutely right. In Indian society, things are pretty different. They are rolled out in a different way altogether and more for women. We have stopped thinking and we got to think a lot more about it at this stage. Thanks.
It's a fascinating book, by the way, and it's a fascinating book.
Interesting. I will definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I shall say it's similar in Pakistan as well. Asian countries have a different, we have different stories to tell. And it's time that we find those voices that are consolidated. Because qualitative lenses, if you go with, I've realized women are not willing to speak. They have forgotten their voices themselves. So there are certain stories that are very interesting. Maybe we can explore those later.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
yes, thanks for bringing it up here.
Do we have some?
Hi, I'm
The
sorry.
board
It
Go
says
ahead.
Gerontology Institute. I'm Candace Kemp. I'm sorry I couldn't change my name. Anne, thank you so much for this. I'm sorry I was a little late joining, but I really enjoyed listening to you as always. I have a question, and maybe it's for you, maybe it's for the group, but the conversation has me thinking about public sociology and public intellectualism and trying to get our word beyond the sociological boundaries. And your last slide talking about policy and thinking about the implications of aging and the work that we do. And that's one thing that I struggle with chronically, I think, is figuring out, I know the work that we're doing is important, but how do we get it out there and make a difference in people's lives, whether that's policy or practice or what have you. And I think that there's so much room for us to do that. Some people are really good at it. So I don't know if anybody has great suggestions for getting it out there beyond, public speaking and publishing. But I just feel like there's so much opportunity to, advance the work in the public sphere in ways that I don't know that as academics we're necessarily really good at doing that.
I mean, I think that's a real challenge, and it's we were talking recently in Canada. Some of the research shows that it takes 17 years is to actually get into something that might be deemed a good idea to actually get it into policy. So that's beyond a time frame that any one individual or scholar can work. I've taken some heart over the years, ironically, from meeting up with former students I'll be amazed. Someone is the director, you know, of senior services for Wellington County, Ontario, or whatever, and they're working at the Division of Aging and Seniors at Health Canada, and I'll meet them on this. They say, "Oh, I took your class, you know, back in the last century," and whatever. And I think about X, Y, or Z. Some of them will very generously say, "I think about this particular every day, almost every day." I think, oh, that's surprising. So they're in a position where they can do something. I'm not in that position. So to the extent that we can make and work to make what we know known broadly. So I think speaking to different groups can help. But I mean, I think you, with your collaboration with Jennifer Kraft Morgan, I think you seem like you've got a good balance and infiltration, if you will, of a policy stream. So sometimes it comes through our collaborators who might be on a team. That's where I think the emergence over my own career of teamwork and collaboration has really been important for advancing policy. And some people, colleagues in public health, I talked about having students in public health in my class. These colleagues in public health are often the ones who got their fingers on the pulse of ways to do this. But I don't know, anybody else have a comment on the screen? I know we're over time and you're generously staying, but
Please do. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I personally don't think that we can do it all.
Yeah, I agree.
So I think that that sometimes what we need to do is trying to push our departments or universities to invest a little bit more on science communicators, people that we can send the gist of what we're doing to and can write more popular science or infiltrate social media or do things. But I don't think we can do it all. And I think that until our incentive platforms work so that we can spend time on this as opposed to something else, I think that it's really difficult to motivate because you don't know how to reach out. Like, yes, public speaking can help, and yes, you could agree to do things for policymakers, but I think in order to put our information out, you need to reach volume, and that you need to have communicators for that. But I don't think universities spend enough time and money on it. Well, I mean, we've been trying in my own department, I think for 15, 20 years
Yeah.
to get the department to hire a communicator.
And Sandra, to your point as well, you've just made me realize at UBC, through the Faculty of Graduate Studies, they've actually had a stream called a Public Scholars Initiative. And part of that has been a focus of like, think about what are the touch points, what are the tools that might, for those who are interested, might be relevant in terms of thinking of positioning your career as a public scholar in sociology, whatever it might be. And when my last position at UBC, I was Associate Vice President Health, looking at many of the health professional programs, but we actually put funding into training for people at the graduate at the graduate school level and the early career scholar end, if you will, to help people move forward there. So there's a sense that there may be tools that an institution like a university can bring to bear rather than putting all the onus on single individuals, to your point, for sure.
Thank you very much for this point. And I start to feel that we actually may have an idea for continuation of these lectures and to place them around topics that were actually introduced today. So, and once again, big thank you for being here this morning with us. I enjoyed also your talk immensely. That was great. It was great also to see other colleagues. We will continue part of these discussions also in ISA meeting that's coming up in Morocco. We have some sessions that are also devoted into how to become politically relevant. So thank you also for your participation here and meeting with us soon in Morocco. But before that, let's hope we'll be able to continue with these lectures again. Until then,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you once again for being with us. Thank to everybody who took the time this morning, evening, afternoons, and see you soon.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Great to see you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.